Berlin. April 1945. Above ground, a city is dying. Beneath its ruins, Adolf Hitler has less than 48 hours to live. By the morning of April 29, 1945, Berlin was no longer the capital of a powerful empire. It had become a city under relentless siege, surrounded by destruction on every side. For weeks, the Soviet Red Army had fought relentlessly across Germany toward Berlin. Now, more than 2 million Soviet troops closed in with overwhelming military force. Streets, bridges, crossroads, and shattered buildings became deadly battlefields under constant bombardment. The proud capital of the Third Reich disappeared beneath smoke, flames, and collapsing concrete. Electricity failed, food supplies dwindled, ammunition ran low, and communications steadily collapsed. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins as civilians struggled to survive the relentless fighting. Deep beneath the devastated streets, Adolf Hitler still refused to admit defeat. The Führerbunker had never been designed to command an empire's final desperate stand. Its narrow corridors, concrete walls, and artificial light created a suffocating underground world. Around Hitler remained only loyal secretaries, officers, doctors, and a handful of trusted aides. Most privately accepted defeat, yet almost no one dared openly challenge Hitler's authority. Outside, Soviet artillery thundered closer, shaking the bunker with every passing hour. Inside, maps covered tables while telephones rang and impossible orders continued without pause. Those commands targeted military units that had already vanished or could no longer fight. During the next 48 hours, the bunker would become the center of history. Decisions made there would bring Adolf Hitler's life to its dramatic conclusion. They would also mark the final collapse of Nazi Germany and its brutal regime. The end had arrived. Berlin's last chapter was about to unfold before the world. By the morning of April 28, 1945, Berlin was living its final days. The Soviet Red Army had fought its way into the heart of the German capital. Street after street had fallen under relentless assault. Buildings burned without pause, smoke covered the skyline, and civilians huddled inside basements as artillery shells crashed across the city. The Third Reich was collapsing before the world's eyes. Nearly 15 meters beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, another day began inside the Führerbunker. As he had done throughout the war, Adolf Hitler gathered his senior officers for the morning military briefing. Large operational maps still covered the conference table, but they no longer reflected reality. Every report arriving from the front carried worse news than the last. Soviet forces had broken through another defensive line. Entire German units had disappeared from radio contact. Fuel and ammunition were running critically low. Berlin was now effectively surrounded. Yet Hitler refused to accept that the battle was lost. He questioned his generals repeatedly, insisting German forces could still launch a counterattack and push the Soviets back. His officers answered cautiously. They knew the reserves Hitler expected no longer existed. The divisions marked on the maps had been destroyed, scattered, or unable to fight. With each passing hour, communications became more fragile. Telephone lines failed under constant bombardment, radio messages arrived late or not at all, and many commanders could no longer report the situation. Inside the bunker, decisions were being made with less reliable information. The isolation was becoming complete. Only days earlier, Hitler had already broken with Hermann Göring, once designated as his successor. After Göring suggested he should assume leadership if Berlin became cut off, Hitler viewed the proposal as an attempt to seize power. Göring was stripped of his authority and placed under arrest, leaving Hitler increasingly suspicious of those closest to him. Then came the news that shattered what little trust remained. Late on April 28, Hitler learned that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of his oldest political allies, had secretly attempted to negotiate Germany's surrender with the Western Allies through Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte. For a brief moment, witnesses recalled, the bunker fell silent. Then Hitler erupted in fury. He denounced Himmler as a traitor, calling the negotiations an unforgivable act of betrayal. Orders were issued for Himmler's arrest, and suspicion quickly spread through the bunker. If one of the regime's most loyal figures had abandoned him, Hitler believed, then loyalty itself had collapsed. Outside, Soviet artillery continued to move closer with every passing hour. Inside, the atmosphere changed completely. Confidence gave way to distrust. Conversations became quieter. Faces reflected exhaustion and uncertainty. The leadership that had once controlled much of Europe was now trapped beneath a ruined city, isolated and increasingly divided from within. As darkness settled over Berlin, one truth had become impossible to escape. The bunker had survived bombs, but not betrayal. Night fell over Berlin as fires illuminated the shattered skyline beneath relentless Soviet bombardment. Artillery flashes lit the darkness while smoke drifted above streets transformed into deadly battlefields. The camera descends beneath the Reich Chancellery into the dim corridors of the Führerbunker. As evening deepened on April 28, the fighting above showed no signs of slowing. Soviet artillery pounded Berlin continuously, shaking buildings already weakened by days of bombardment. Every explosion echoed across the city as defenders steadily lost ground to advancing Soviet forces. Each passing hour brought Soviet troops closer to Berlin's government district. Deep underground, tension continued to grow inside the heavily fortified Führerbunker. Bright electric lamps illuminated narrow corridors, but normal life had completely disappeared. Staff members quietly carried messages, updated maps, and answered increasingly silent telephones. Many military communications had already been lost as Germany's command structure collapsed. The few remaining reports arriving inside the bunker offered little reason for optimism. Everyone present understood the military situation could no longer be reversed. Repeated suggestions urged Eva Braun to escape while routes remained open. She refused every opportunity, choosing instead to remain beside Hitler until the end. To Eva Braun, there seemed to be no future beyond the bunker walls. Joseph Goebbels also refused to abandon Hitler during the regime's final hours. Unlike several senior officials, Goebbels rejected escape or separate negotiations. His wife Magda and their 6 children remained inside the bunker as well. The underground shelter held officers, doctors, guards, secretaries, and loyal staff. Conversations became quieter as hope disappeared and reality settled over everyone. Some privately discussed suicide rather than falling into enemy hands. Others packed personal belongings or wrote final letters to loved ones. Few believed they would ever leave Berlin alive. During the night, Hitler focused on the written record he intended to leave behind. He began dictating what became known as his political testament. The document outlined his political views and appointed successors after his death. He continued rejecting responsibility for Germany's catastrophic defeat. Former associates accused of betrayal were dismissed in his final statements. Hitler then dictated his personal will containing instructions about his possessions. Secretaries worked tirelessly beside typewriters despite the constant artillery overhead. Multiple copies of both documents were produced under increasingly desperate conditions. The rhythmic sound of typing mixed with distant explosions above the bunker. Messengers carried pages between adjoining rooms for review and signatures. Outside, Soviet troops advanced steadily toward the Reich Chancellery. Remaining German defenders struggled to hold shrinking pockets of resistance. Fresh reports confirmed the Soviet advance through central Berlin. Inside the bunker, almost no one doubted the outcome anymore. A government that once ruled much of Europe had been reduced to a handful of officials. They gathered beneath a city that now lay devastated by war. Military options had vanished as communications continued to fail. Any remaining hopes of relief had completely disappeared. By the early hours of April 29, Germany's defeat was undeniable. The collapse was no longer a possibility but an unavoidable reality. Then, shortly after midnight, Hitler made one final personal decision. That decision would shape the final chapter inside the Führerbunker. Shortly after midnight on April 29, 1945, deep beneath the ruins of Berlin, an unexpected ceremony took place. Soviet troops were already fighting only a short distance from the Reich Chancellery above. Inside the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun. The civil ceremony was brief and attended by only a handful of trusted staff members. After confirming their identities, the couple signed the official marriage register. Witnesses also signed the document, making the marriage legally complete. There were no crowds, no celebrations, and no sense of optimism beyond the bunker walls. Everyone present understood that Germany's defeat was now unavoidable. After the ceremony, those inside gathered for a modest reception. A small amount of champagne was served, and brief congratulations were exchanged. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as restrained rather than joyful. Outside, artillery fire continued almost without interruption. The sounds of battle echoed through the bunker as Berlin continued to collapse. The ceremony ended quickly, and attention returned to the military crisis. Throughout the morning, Hitler received fresh military reports. Every update painted the same grim picture. Soviet forces were advancing deeper into central Berlin. German defenders struggled to hold isolated positions across the city. Communication with many military units had already broken down. In some cases, commanders no longer knew where friendly forces remained. Despite reality, Hitler continued issuing military orders. He instructed scattered formations to defend their positions. Some orders involved units that no longer existed as effective fighting forces. Many officers understood these directives could not change the outcome. Yet the routine of giving and receiving orders continued. During the day, another concern became increasingly important. The possibility of capture by Soviet forces weighed heavily on those inside. Cyanide capsules were distributed to several people in the bunker. According to historical accounts, Hitler wanted reassurance that the capsules would work. Escape from Berlin was becoming increasingly unlikely. A small number of senior officials met with Hitler during these final hours. Their conversations focused on military reports and personal farewells. They also discussed practical arrangements for what lay ahead. The atmosphere had changed dramatically from earlier years of the war. Confidence had disappeared, replaced by exhaustion and resignation. The collapse of the regime was now impossible to ignore. Above ground, Soviet soldiers continued advancing through Berlin streets. Heavy fighting raged only a few blocks from the bunker complex. Smoke, fire, and collapsing buildings dominated the city above. Underground, the remaining leadership waited inside reinforced rooms. They were increasingly isolated from the city they once controlled. By the evening of April 29, the outcome had become unmistakable. The government that once directed war across Europe had been reduced to a handful of officials. Every new military report confirmed that Soviet forces were drawing closer. Inside the bunker, preparations shifted from military planning to personal affairs. Those remaining understood that the end was rapidly approaching. By nightfall, Hitler had made his final decision. The last full day of the Third Reich's leader had come to an end. On the morning of April 30, 1945, the Führerbunker remained tense and quiet. Above ground, Soviet forces continued closing in on central Berlin. Inside the bunker, Adolf Hitler ate a simple vegetarian meal. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as subdued and unusually silent. Staff members continued their duties with calm professionalism. Most understood that Germany's military situation had become hopeless. The collapse of the regime now appeared only a matter of time. Later that morning, Hitler received his final military briefing. Senior officers delivered reports from the remaining German forces. Berlin had been completely surrounded by Soviet troops. No relief force could reach the capital. Communications with many military units had almost completely failed. Remaining defenders were isolated throughout the city. Organized resistance inside Berlin could no longer be sustained. The final military briefing confirmed there was no realistic path forward. During the afternoon, Hitler met members of the bunker staff one last time. Secretaries, aides, guards, and household employees gathered quietly. He thanked those who had remained in Berlin until the end. Witnesses described the farewells as brief and formal. Few words were exchanged during these final moments. Everyone present understood what was about to happen. The atmosphere reflected resignation rather than hope. Later that afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to their private room. Staff members remained outside the closed door. The bunker grew unusually quiet as everyone waited. Time passed without interruption. Eventually, aides entered the private room. According to surviving witnesses and later investigations, Hitler had died by suicide. Eva Braun had also taken her own life. Their deaths marked the effective end of the Nazi regime's central leadership. Fighting, however, continued throughout Berlin. The wider war in Europe had not yet ended. Following Hitler's previous instructions, preparations began immediately. Staff members wrapped both bodies in blankets. They carried them through the bunker's emergency exit. Outside lay the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Soviet artillery continued bombarding the surrounding area. Despite the shelling, petrol was poured over the remains. The bodies were set alight according to Hitler's instructions. The process was carried out as quickly as possible. Those involved soon returned underground for safety. Inside the bunker, an uneasy silence replaced constant activity. Conversations became short and infrequent. Many realized the political leadership had effectively ceased to function. Some personnel remained faithfully at their assigned posts. Others quietly considered surrender or escape. The bunker itself had become increasingly isolated. Under Hitler's political testament, Joseph Goebbels became Reich Chancellor. In reality, his authority extended little beyond the bunker. Berlin remained completely surrounded by Soviet forces. Military communications had almost entirely collapsed. Organized resistance across the city was rapidly disintegrating. Those remaining felt exhaustion and uncertainty rather than optimism. Within days Berlin fell, and Germany's unconditional surrender brought the war in Europe to its conclusion.